In December 2011, the world watched these images from North Korea. People were crying uncontrollably. They had just learned that their leader, Kim Jong-Il, was dead. To someone watching from the outside, this reaction might seem strange, even forced. Why would people cry so intensely for a dictator? But to understand these tears, we have to understand their world. In North Korea, they weren't just mourning a leader, they were mourning their god. North Korea, a small, isolated country that holds the power to cause mass destruction. It has a hostile relationship with the West, and tensions are always rising. Can the Kim dynasty, the world's only communist family dynasty, continue to survive? Do the people of North Korea truly love and worship their leader? Or is this all just a performance for the cameras, a show to stay alive? To find the answers, we must go back to the very beginning. From its creation in 1948 to the modern-day regime, this is the full story of North Korea. Our story begins before North Korea even existed. In 1910, the entire Korean peninsula became a part of the Japanese Empire. To the world, Japan said it was a project to civilize Korea, but for the Korean people, it was a time of deep suffering. Japan ran Korea like a military colony. Japanese was the official language. Korean history and culture were suppressed. Teachers in schools carried weapons, and a huge police force watched every aspect of life. Japan did bring new factories and industries to Korea, but this progress came at a great cost. The Korean people were treated as second-class citizens in their own land. The wealth and valuable resources from their country were not used to help them. Instead, they were taken away and sent to Japan, the imperial masters. Many Koreans resisted. Small groups of guerrilla fighters fought back bitterly, but they were eventually crushed. The resistance seemed to be over, but the anger of the Korean people never went away. They dreamed of one day being free. After World War I ended, this dream felt closer than ever. In 1919, massive protests for independence erupted across the country. The Japanese response was brutal. In one horrific case, they locked hundreds of protesters inside a church and burned them alive. But this violence could not kill the dream of freedom. It only made the fire of Korean nationalism burn brighter. And at the front of this movement were the communists. Among these communists was a young man who would one day define the fate of Korea. His name was Kim Il-sung. North Korean history books tell us that Kim was a hero from a young age, fighting the Japanese with his father. The reality is more complicated. We know he joined a Chinese communist guerrilla group in the 1930s. He was a capable soldier and rose through the ranks. In 1937, Kim led a small raid on a Japanese police station in a town called Pochombo. From a military perspective, the attack was tiny, but for propaganda, it was gold. Kim Il-sung would later use this small victory as the founding myth of his revolution. He wrote that the flames over Pochombo heralded the dawn of the liberation of Korea. It was the perfect story of a hero fighting for his people. His success earned him the nickname the Tiger. The Japanese army was now hunting him personally. The pressure was too great. Kim was forced to flee Korea and cross the border into the Soviet Union. His time as a guerrilla fighter was over. But his path to power was just beginning. In 1945, Japan surrendered, ending World War II. Korea was finally free from Japanese rule, but it would not be free for long. A new global conflict was starting, the Cold War, between the Communist Soviet Union and the capitalist United States. Korea became a pawn in their game. The Soviets occupied the northern half of the peninsula, and the Americans occupied the southern half. They drew a line on a map, the 38th parallel, and suddenly, one country became two. This temporary line would soon become a permanent, heavily armed border. The Soviets needed a Korean leader to run the north for them. They found their man in Kim Il-sung. He had spent the war in a Soviet military camp, receiving training and becoming a loyal communist. In 1945, he returned to his homeland, not as a guerrilla fighter, but as the Soviets' chosen leader. Back in Korea, Kim Il-sung, with the full support of the Soviets, began to build his new state. He created the Korean People's Army, or KPA. He started a series of reforms that were very popular with the people. A major land reform took land from wealthy Japanese collaborators and gave it to poor farmers. This made him a hero to the peasant class. Then, in 1946, he introduced a law for gender equality, giving women equal rights to work, a radical idea at the time. These reforms worked. In the first few years after the war, North Korea's economy recovered surprisingly quickly. But behind the scenes, a storm was brewing. There were different groups of communists in North Korea, and not all of them trusted Kim. There were communists who had stayed in Korea, communists who returned from China, and Kim's own group, who returned from the Soviet Union. Kim knew that to have total power, he had to eliminate all his rivals. By 1950, Kim Il-sung felt strong. His army was powerful, and his people seemed to support him. But his ultimate dream was not just to rule the North. It was to reunite all of Korea under his communist rule. He traveled to Moscow to ask the Soviet leader, Joseph Stalin, for permission to invade the South. At first, Stalin said no. He was afraid of starting a direct war with the United States. But Kim was persistent. He promised a quick victory, claiming that the people in the South would rise up and welcome his soldiers as liberators. Finally, Stalin gave him the green light, but with a condition: the Soviet Red Army would not fight. If Kim needed help, he would have to ask the new communist leader of China, Mao Zedong. The stage was set for war. On June the 25th, 1950, North Korean tanks, planes, and soldiers poured across the 38th parallel. The attack was a massive surprise. The South Korean army was poorly equipped and completely outnumbered. North Korea's air force was 10 times larger. They had hundreds of modern tanks. The South had none. Seoul, the capital of South Korea, fell in just 3 days. The North Korean army pushed south, trapping the remaining South Korean and American forces in a small corner of the peninsula around the city of Busan. It looked like Kim Il-sung's dream of a quick victory was about to come true. But he had underestimated the United States. President Truman saw the invasion not just as an attack on South Korea, but as a direct challenge from the communist world. He ordered a massive military response. Under the banner of the United Nations, American troops led a daring counterattack. In September 1950, US General Douglas MacArthur launched a brilliant and risky amphibious invasion at Incheon, a port far behind enemy lines. The move was a stunning success. It cut off the North Korean army's supply lines. The tide of the war turned almost overnight. UN forces quickly recaptured Seoul and pushed north across the 38th parallel. Now, the goal was no longer just to save South Korea, but to destroy Kim Il-sung's regime and reunite Korea under Western control. UN troops captured Pyongyang, the North Korean capital. Kim Il-sung and his government were forced to flee, hiding in the mountains near the Chinese border. His army was shattered. The war seemed to be over, but then another superpower entered the fight. China's leader, Mao Zedong, could not accept an American allied country on his border. He warned the UN not to approach the Yalu River, which separated Korea from China. When the warning was ignored, he made a fateful decision. In late 1950, hundreds of thousands of Chinese soldiers, called the People's Volunteers, secretly crossed the river and launched a massive surprise attack. The UN forces were completely overwhelmed and forced into a long, brutal retreat. Pyongyang was retaken by the communists. Seoul was captured again for a short time. The war had turned once more. Kim Il-sung was back in control of North Korea, but he was not happy. He had lost most of his own army, and now it was the Chinese who were doing most of the fighting. His dream of being the great liberator of Korea was dead. He was now dependent on his powerful allies. The war devolved into a bloody stalemate, a brutal fight of attrition along the 38th parallel. For 2 more years, both sides fought and died over small hills and valleys, gaining almost no ground. Finally, in 1953, An armistice was signed. The war was over, but no one had won. The Korean War left the peninsula in ruins. Millions of people, soldiers and civilians, were dead. Cities, towns, and villages in both the north and south were completely destroyed. The border was right back where it started, at the 38th parallel. All the death and destruction had been for nothing. For Kim Il-sung, the war was a political disaster. He had failed to unite the country. And worse, his promise that the southern masses would rise up to support him was proven false. They had rejected communism. He knew someone had to be blamed. And it wasn't going to be him. Kim Il-sung was a master of political survival. He turned the failure of the war into an opportunity. He began a series of brutal purges, accusing his internal rivals of being spies for America and traitors who had sabotaged the war effort. One by one, his enemies were arrested, put on show trials, and executed. He eliminated every communist faction that was not completely loyal to him. He skillfully redirected all the anger and resentment away from himself and onto his scapegoats. By the end of the 1950s, all opposition was gone. Kim Il-sung was no longer just a leader. He was the absolute, unquestioned ruler of North Korea. He now had the power to shape the entire country in his own image, and he would create one of the most unique and disturbing political systems the world has ever seen. With all his rivals gone, Kim began to build a massive cult of personality around himself. This went far beyond the propaganda of other communist leaders like Stalin or Mao. In 1953, he declared himself Suryong, or Great Leader. He became the living embodiment of the nation itself. Propaganda was everywhere. History books were rewritten to make him the sole hero of the revolution. Children were taught that he was a godlike figure, a loving parent to all Koreans. Every success was his success. Every failure was the fault of enemies. To criticize Kim Il-sung was to criticize the nation itself. It was treason. The level of worship that Kim and his family receive in North Korea to this day is one of the most shocking aspects of the regime. It was a system designed to ensure that no one would ever be able to challenge his power again. With total power in his hands, Kim Il-sung now faced a massive challenge: rebuilding a country that had been completely destroyed by war. With huge amounts of aid from the Soviet Union and China, North Korea began to rebuild at an incredible speed. The government poured all its resources into heavy industry, steel mills, chemical plants, and power stations. Kim launched the Cholima movement, named after a mythical winged horse that could travel hundreds of miles in a single day. The goal was to rebuild the economy at a superhuman pace. And for a while, it seemed to work. The numbers looked great. By the late 1950s, North Korea's economy was actually growing faster than South Korea's, which was still a poor, agricultural country. North Korea was seen by many in the communist world as a success story. But underneath the surface, there were serious problems. The government was obsessed with meeting production targets, or quotas. Quantity was everything. Quality meant nothing. Factory managers who failed to meet their quotas were punished, so they were forced to lie about their numbers. This created a fake reality on paper, while the real economy was struggling. This system also created a culture of laziness. Workers would rush to produce low-quality goods at the end of each month just to meet the target. The foundation of the North Korean economy was built on lies and poor workmanship. These problems would eventually lead to total disaster. As Kim Il-sung built his economy, he also developed a unique political ideology for North Korea. He called it Juche. The idea was simple: self-reliance. Kim had learned a hard lesson during the Korean War. He could not depend on the Soviets or the Chinese. To survive, North Korea had to stand on its own 2 feet. It needed a strong military to defend itself and a strong economy to support itself, without help from the outside world. But Juche became much more than just a policy. It became a religion. The government's propaganda machine went into overdrive. It created an image of North Korea as a perfect paradise, a special country free from all the problems that affected the rest of the world. According to official propaganda, there was no crime in North Korea. There were no social problems like homelessness or unemployment. Teachers claimed that their students never misbehaved. One kindergarten teacher even said that blindness and deafness no longer existed in North Korean children because those were failures of the old world. Of course, none of this was true. It was a carefully constructed illusion. The goal was to completely isolate the North Korean people from reality, to make them believe that they were living in the best country on earth. All thanks to the wisdom of their great leader, Kim Il-sung. By the late 1960s, North Korea had become one of the most isolated and militarized countries in the world. Having consolidated his power at home, Kim Il-sung began to act more aggressively on the world stage. He wanted to destabilize South Korea and prove his strength to the United States. On the night of January 17, 1968, a team of 31 elite North Korean commandos secretly crossed the heavily guarded border into South Korea. Their mission was top secret and incredibly dangerous: to sneak into the presidential palace in Seoul, known as the Blue House, and assassinate the South Korean president, Park Chung-hee. For days, they moved like ghosts, avoiding detection. They were just a few hundred meters from their target when they were stopped by South Korean police. A fierce gunfight erupted on the streets of Seoul. The assassination attempt failed. Nearly all the commandos were killed. The one who was captured revealed the entire plan. The incident shocked South Korea and the world, but Kim Il-sung was just getting started. Just a few days later, on January 23, 1968, North Korean patrol boats surrounded and attacked an American naval ship, the USS Pueblo, in international waters. The Pueblo was a spy ship, pretending to be a research vessel, but it was only lightly armed. One American sailor was killed, and the other 82 crew members were captured. It was a huge international crisis. The United States was furious, but with the Vietnam War raging, it could not risk another full-scale war in Korea. The crew of the Pueblo spent 11 terrifying months in North Korean prisons, where they were tortured and used as propaganda tools. They were finally released after the US was forced to make a public apology, an apology it retracted the moment the men were free. For North Korea, it was a massive propaganda victory. They had faced down the mighty United States and won. Perhaps the most bizarre and brutal incident happened 8 years later, in 1976, in the Demilitarized Zone, or DMZ, the border between North and South. A large poplar tree was blocking the view for a United Nations checkpoint. A team of American and South Korean soldiers went to trim the tree. Suddenly, they were swarmed by North Korean soldiers. The North Korean commander ordered them to stop. When the American captain, Arthur Boniface, turned his back, the North Korean commander screamed, "Kill him!" The North Koreans attacked with axes and clubs, killing Captain Boniface and another American officer, Mark Barrett. The world was horrified by the sheer brutality of the axe murder incident. The United States responded with a massive show of force, sending nuclear-capable bombers flying over the DMZ. They returned to the same spot and cut down the entire tree. Tensions were at a breaking point. For the first time in its history, the Kim regime seemed to take a small step back. Kim Il-sung expressed a regret over the incident, the closest he would ever come to an apology. As Kim Il-sung grew older, he began to prepare his eldest son, Kim Jong-il, to take his place. As Kim Jong-il's influence grew in the 1980s, North Korea's behavior seemed to get even more reckless. The country became involved in state-sponsored terrorism. In 1983, the South Korean president Chun Doo-hwan was on a state visit to Rangoon, Burma. North Korean agents planted a powerful bomb in the roof of a mausoleum where the president was scheduled to lay a wreath. The bomb went off too early. The president was still in his car and survived, but the blast killed 21 other people, including several of South Korea's top government ministers. It was a bloody massacre. 4 years later, they did something even more horrifying. On November 29, 1987, Korean Air Flight 858 was flying from Baghdad to Seoul. 2 North Korean agents, posing as Japanese tourists, planted a bomb on the plane during a stopover in Abu Dhabi. They got off the plane, leaving the bomb behind. The plane exploded over the Andaman Sea, killing all 115 people on board. The agents were tracked down. The male agent killed himself with a cyanide pill, but the female agent, Kim Hyun-hui, was captured alive. She confessed that the order came directly from Kim Jong-Il himself. The goal, she said, was to scare people away from attending the 1988 Seoul Olympics. The international community was outraged. The United States officially declared North Korea a state sponsor of terrorism. The country was now more isolated than ever before, but inside their bubble, the Kims didn't seem to care. To distract the people from their growing economic problems and their country's terrible reputation, Pyongyang began to spend billions on massive building projects. They built giant monuments, a massive sports stadium, and the triumphal arch of reunification. The most famous of these projects was the Ryugyong Hotel. It was designed to be the tallest hotel in the world, a 105-story pyramid-shaped monster that would dominate the Pyongyang skyline. Construction began in 1987. It was meant to be a symbol of North Korea's power and modernity. Instead, it became a symbol of its failure. As the 1980s came to a close, a seismic event happened that would change the world and seal North Korea's fate. The Berlin Wall fell. The Cold War was ending. And North Korea's most important ally, the Soviet Union, was about to collapse. The flow of cheap fuel, aid, and trade from the communist world suddenly stopped. North Korea's broken economy could not survive on its own. The country was headed for a catastrophe. And at this exact moment of crisis, the great leader, the godlike figure who had ruled for nearly 50 years, would die, leaving his son to inherit a nation on the brink of collapse.
조선노동당 총비서이시며 조선민주주의인민공화국 국방위원회.
On July 8th, 1994, the sky seemed to fall on North Korea. Kim Il-sung, the great leader, the eternal father of the nation, was dead from a heart attack. After 46 years of absolute rule, the only leader the country had ever known was gone. For the North Korean people, it was an earth-shattering event. The propaganda had worked. They truly believed he was a demigod. Now, a nation held its breath. For the first time in history, a communist state would be passed down from father to son. The world watched, wondering if the country could even survive without its founder. The new leader was Kim Jong-il. Known as the Dear Leader, he was very different from his father. While his father had been a tall, charismatic guerrilla commander, Kim Jong-il was shorter, heavier, and known for his secret love of fine cognac and Hollywood movies. He had been groomed for power for decades, but he was taking over at the worst possible moment. The Soviet Union was gone. The cheap oil and aid had disappeared. North Korea was alone, and its broken, self-reliant Juche economy was about to face the ultimate test. It would fail completely. What followed was one of the greatest tragedies of the 20th century. North Koreans call it the arduous march. The rest of the world calls it the Great Famine. It was a perfect storm of disaster. The loss of Soviet support, combined with years of terrible economic planning, was made worse by a series of devastating floods and droughts. The state's food distribution system, the heart of its socialist promise, completely collapsed. The government could no longer feed its people. The result was starvation on an unimaginable scale. People were forced to eat grass, tree bark, and roots to survive. The official paradise of North Korea became a living hell. We will never know the exact death toll. The regime hides the truth. But international observers estimate that anywhere from 600,000 to over 3 million people starved to death. But out of this horror, something new and unexpected was born. To survive, ordinary North Koreans began to break the law. They created illegal private markets called jangmadang. They bought, sold, and traded goods just to feed their families. It was the birth of a small grassroots capitalism, born not from policy, but from pure desperation. These markets would slowly change North Korean society from the inside out. How did Kim Jong-il's regime respond to this catastrophe? Did it reform the economy? Did it open up to the world? No, it did the opposite. It announced a new national policy, Jong Un, or military first. The logic was simple and brutal. In a country that was falling apart, the only thing that could hold it together was the army. The regime poured what little money it had into its military, even while its people were starving. A strong military could prevent riots at home, and it could be used to threaten the outside world. This led to the second part of Kim Jong-il's survival strategy: nuclear blackmail. The North had been interested in nuclear technology for decades, mostly for energy, but now it became their ultimate survival tool. Kim Jong-il believed that if North Korea had a nuclear bomb, the United States would never dare to attack it. It was the ultimate life insurance policy for his regime. This began a predictable and dangerous game that continues to this day. North Korea would advance its nuclear program, creating a crisis. The world, led by the US, would panic. Then, they would offer North Korea a deal. Freeze your nuclear program, and in return, we will give you massive amounts of food and fuel aid. North Korea would agree, take the aid, and then, a few years later, secretly restart its weapons program. It was a brilliant and cynical playbook of blackmail. The military-first policy also led to real conflict. North Korea was always unhappy with the sea border drawn after the Korean War, which gave the South control of valuable fishing waters. During the famine, those fishing grounds became even more tempting. In June 1999, North Korean patrol boats crossed the line, leading to a naval battle that left dozens of sailors dead or wounded. Similar clashes would happen again and again over the years, a constant reminder of how close the two Koreas are to another full-scale war. By the late 2000s, Kim Jong-il's health was failing. He had suffered a stroke in 2008. His public appearances became rare. Then, in December 2011, the state media made a tearful announcement. The dear leader had died of a heart attack while on a train trip.
조선노동당 총비서
And so the world saw those incredible images of mass grief, the same scenes that had marked his father's death 17 years earlier. The cycle was repeating. It was time for a new Kim to take power. But unlike his father, who had almost 20 years to prepare, this new leader was an almost complete unknown. He was young, he was inexperienced, and no one in the outside world knew what to expect. His name was Kim Jong Un. Kim Jong Un was never supposed to be the leader. His older half-brother, Kim Jong-nam, was the first choice. But Kim Jong-nam fell out of favor after he embarrassed the regime in 2001, when he was caught trying to enter Japan on a fake passport to visit Tokyo Disneyland. The next choice was Kim Jong-un. He was educated in secret at a private school in Switzerland, where classmates knew him as Pak-un and remembered him as a quiet kid who loved basketball, video games, and Michael Jordan. He was a complete mystery. When he was revealed to the world as the heir, analysts scrambled to figure out who he was. Would this young man, with his Western education, be a reformer? Would he finally open North Korea up? He would provide an answer very quickly, and it was a terrifying one. When Kim Jong-un took power, he was surrounded by his father's old, experienced generals and officials. The most powerful of them all was his own uncle, Jang Song-thaek. Many believed Jang was the real power behind the throne, a regent guiding his young nephew. But Kim Jong-un would not be a puppet. He needed to prove that he was in charge. In late 2013, he did the unthinkable. He had his own uncle publicly arrested, dragged out of a party meeting, and accused of being a traitor. Days later, Jang was executed. The message was clear and brutal. There is only one power in North Korea. 4 years later, his half-brother, Kim Jong-nam, the one who wanted to go to Disneyland, was assassinated in a Malaysian airport. 2 women smeared a deadly VX nerve agent on his face. The world believes the order came directly from Pyongyang. With his uncle and brother gone, Kim Jong-un's power was now absolute. While he was consolidating his power with brutal force, Kim Jong-un also showed a bizarre and unpredictable side to the world. He struck up a strange friendship with former NBA star Dennis Rodman. Rodman visited North Korea multiple times, calling Kim his friend for life. In 2014, he was famously filmed singing "Happy Birthday" to the dictator in a stadium full of people. While it looked like a joke to the rest of the world, it was a strange form of soft power diplomacy, a personal connection to a leader no one else could reach. But behind the strange friendships, Kim Jong-Un was pursuing his family's ultimate goal with a speed and intensity that shocked the world. He dramatically accelerated North Korea's nuclear and missile programs. Under his watch, North Korea conducted multiple nuclear tests, each more powerful than the last. They launched a terrifying array of new missiles, including ones they claimed could reach the mainland United States. For the first time, the threat was no longer regional. It was global. This led to one of the strangest diplomatic showdowns in modern history. In 2017, the new American president, Donald Trump, met Kim Jong-un's threats with a unique brand of diplomacy on Twitter. Trump called Kim Little Rocket Man and threatened him with fire and fury like the world has never seen. Kim called Trump a mentally deranged US dotard. Just when it seemed like war was inevitable, the tune suddenly changed. In a stunning reversal, the two leaders agreed to meet. In 2018, Donald Trump became the first sitting US president to meet with a North Korean leader. They met in Singapore, then again in Vietnam, and Trump even stepped across the border into North Korea at the DMZ. The meetings were historic media spectacles, full of handshakes and friendly words. But in the end, they achieved very little. North Korea refused to give up its nuclear weapons, and the US refused to lift its crippling sanctions. The diplomacy of spectacle was over. Today, North Korea remains a country of shocking contrasts. In the capital, Pyongyang, there is a growing class of newly rich citizens, the Donju, or masters of money. They enjoy expensive restaurants, coffee shops, and department stores. They have access to a life that is unimaginable for the rest of the country. But for most of the 25 million people living outside this bubble, life remains a desperate struggle in one of the poorest and most repressive countries on earth. The regime has found new ways to survive, earning money through sophisticated cyber attacks, stealing billions of dollars from banks and cryptocurrency exchanges around the world. And it continues to rule its people with an iron fist. The border is now more secure than ever, making it nearly impossible to escape. For over 75 years, 3 generations of a single family have ruled North Korea. They have created a nation built on a foundation of myths, propaganda, and fear. They have survived the end of the Cold War, a catastrophic famine, and crushing international pressure. The country itself feels like a relic from another time, a black hole in a region of vibrant modern democracies. The gap between North and South Korea is now the largest between any two countries that share a border in the world. The ultimate question remains: how long can this last? Can the kingdom of the Kims, a bizarre and brutal dynasty unlike any other, continue to survive in the 21st century? Or will the tears of the people one day be for the fall of the regime and not for its leader? Only time will tell.